I think the mission basically doesn't matter.
Not only have you started 3 companies, but you have started 3 companies with the same people.
It was much more, I want to work with these folks on something rather than, oh, I'm super passionate about the Linux kernel or about group chat or accounting.
Provocative question, are you passionate about the Linux kernel?
No. If you are in a room with a bunch of people who you think are awesome and you're getting a chance to do good work every day, that's super motivating. On your bad days, it's not really going to matter that you're curing cancer.
Hey everyone, welcome to the -1 podcast, where we interview the most interesting people in the world about the winding paths that their journeys have taken to where they are today. So I'm really excited today to welcome Waseem, who's been a long-time colleague and friend, one of the earliest members of SPC, back to South Park Commons to talk about his -1 journey. Welcome, Waseem.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
One of the things that is rare about your journey is that you have done 3 separate successful companies, right? K-Splice being your first go, then Zulip, which obviously was acquired into Dropbox, and now most recently Pilot. So in some ways, more than most people, you've had kind of like more goes at the -1. So I want to rewind you back perhaps to your K-Splice days. Take us a little bit through how that ideation journey came about.
Sure. It was principally about the team and the people that I was excited to work with. Like in particular for K-Splice, K-Splice was Jeff Arnold, my co-founder Jeff Arnold's master's thesis at MIT. He had had this experience. First of all, what was K-Splice? K-Splice was software for updating, running Linux systems without rebooting. And this was Jeff's master's thesis at MIT. He was born out of pain. He had administering servers as a student, as part of the Student Computer Club. And he was like, hey, I think we have something here. Let's do a company around it. And my perspective was like, yeah, okay, cool. Let's do it. Like, I like these folks. Like, let's do something together. It was much more, I want to work with these folks on something rather than, oh, I'm super passionate about the Linux kernel or about group chat or accounting, as the case may be in each of these companies.
And you've often talked about your companies kind of being born from pain, right? But do you think, if you had to rewind, perhaps to ask a provocative question, are you passionate about the Linux kernel?
No. I mean, it's cool. Like, the tech was cool.
Okay.
But when you're in it, you like get so in it. And I think there's one of these things where it's like passion in part, in a very real way, I think like follows where you spend your time rather than necessarily like being the input. It's like sort of the output of,
okay,
what you end up doing.
Okay, so that is already an emerging, probably perhaps the non-consensus point of view in Silicon Valley, which is that passion is an emergent property of essentially working on something that, with a bunch of folks who are smart, talented, that you enjoy hanging out with, that you have a personal relationship with. And in some ways that if you build something that is sufficiently interesting and being used by people, then passion is kind of an emergent property.
Yeah, I strongly believe that. And maybe the most provocative way of saying it is I think the mission basically doesn't matter. Like,
okay,
if you are in a room with a bunch of people who you think are awesome and you're getting a chance to do good work every day, like that is super motivating. And that's not really a function of the specific domain you're in. Now, the place the domain may matter is like, well, it could affect your ability to attract and retain other great people to work with. So it is an input into what you do, but I think your day-to-day happiness is rarely materially shaped by the mission or the purpose. Like on your bad days, it's not really going to matter that you're curing cancer.
Yeah. I don't know if I've ever talked about this publicly myself, but I would probably put my Facebook journey in that same bucket. So when I joined Facebook, I was not a user of Facebook. Facebook had launched at Carnegie Mellon. Carnegie Mellon was a 49th school to launch, and it had launched after I graduated, and I didn't have access to my cmu.edu email, so I'd never signed up for it. But I joined the company because the people were amazing. Mark was, kind of a legendary leader even at that point. And it was just like fun. You show up, there are hard, interesting problems. And I do think that growth and early momentum played a part in it, because you kind of get that feedback loop of like, I'm doing something, somebody seems to like it, so I want to do more of it. And then over time, the mission does kind of build on you, right? Like that is an emergent property of like essentially, I think, momentum and having fun. So does that sound right?
I definitely agree. I mean, this was one of your phrases from back at Dropbox. You used to talk a lot about winning.
Yes.
And I do think that just like being on the winning team, a team where it feels like it is going well, like people, I think, underweight that and they overweight other properties.
Right. And this is also an interesting kind of like petri dish, because not only have you started 3 companies, but you have started 3 companies with the same people, right? I would actually argue, I don't think I've ever met that condition before, where like 3rd company, but with 3 same co-founders. So do you think it's different between you and Jeff and Jessica? Do you think one of the 3 of you might be more a priori, like, mission driven?
I'm not sure. I think actually probably not.
Okay.
Well, again, the through line on all of the companies, I think, was like a problem that we ourselves personally had.
Right.
It wasn't just sort of like, we got in a room, we did some whiteboarding. We're like, oh, plumbers in Kansas have this problem, therefore, like, let's go work on it. They were generally problems that were informed by pain we ourselves had. And I think that was sort of consistent among the 3 of us.
So it sounds like one of the things you're saying is that stop focusing so much on like, I must love this problem so much that I want to work on it for the rest of my life. Just like focus on getting some momentum and finding people to work with, and then kind of like let that grow on itself.
Yeah, I mean, ideally you have both items present, right? But if you have an amazing idea that you love and you have no momentum, it's going to be awful. And if you have tons of momentum and maybe you're kind of so-so on the problem, I think you do end up falling in love with it.
Okay, so you did K-Splice. It's actually a really cool piece of technology. I don't know whether it's now is it standard issue for most Linux kernels now?
I mean, it's definitely still part of Oracle's Linux offering. And I think Red Hat has its own version, and like some of the other providers, I think maybe have their own version.
Got it. I mean, listen, so were you at Oracle for a short while?
I was at Oracle for a year and a day.
Okay, great. I was at Oracle for 6 months and a day, let's say. But you stayed there for a year and a day, and then you left to start Zulip. And Zulip was actually kind of a phenomenal product. Arguably maybe a little ahead of its time. But I'm curious, like, tell me a little bit more about the early days of leaving and arriving at that idea.
Sure. And so I think, our thinking evolved really for all 3 of these companies, which is for K-Splice, the process was basically Jeff has this cool technology. We're all Linux nerds. We think there are other Linux nerds in the world that would want this. Like, let's build a company around it. And that was basically the extent that we sort of rigorously analyzed the problem or the domain. With Zulip, it was like, okay, well, what was the problem we were solving? The problem we were solving is at K-Splice, we were in search of a robust group chat tool for businesses. And this was, just to set the stage, this was like pre-Slack. Like the state of the art at the time was like IRC or HipChat or Campfire. They didn't have mobile apps, and like HipChat was like an Adobe Air application. It was like Flash kind of. It just like the stuff did not really work very well. And so we said, okay, we think that we could build something better that like has a mobile app, that has good search, like is like a nice, robustly built modern web app. And also we sort of had another take on it, which is we thought that if you embedded threading as kind of a first-class notion in the application, that you would get something that worked well, both synchronously and asynchronously. And then we thought, well, okay, fine, how big could this be? Well, actually, every business does have this problem. And so I think we were right about the market size in the sense that if you look at the adoption and the valuation and the growth of Slack, like the time and shape were basically right. So I think we were correct in the thesis. I had only have some notes for us on how we executed, but that's a little bit about how we got there. It was a problem we had when we were operating K-Splice, which is how do we, what should we be doing for chat?
So I'm always kind of curious to dig into the details, right? Is this top-down ideation? Is this bottoms-up in the sense that top-down, you identify a market, then you go and kind of like essentially build out the business case for it and then kind of go out and essentially build it? Or was it a little bit more like, this could be cool, I'm going to go start building it, and then essentially let the overall narrative come out of like the act of building? Or was there somewhere in between?
For Zulip specifically, it was, again, about a specific problem to be solved. So it was not a top-down analysis. And the origins of Zulip specifically is there was a group chat tool at MIT called Zephyr, which was this like 1980s messaging tool that was kind of contemporaneous with IRC and like used in a very, very niche way at MIT. Mm-hmm. And it was actually what we used internally at K-Splice. And so one of the pitches, kind of as we thought about it, was like, can we bring this idea of Zephyr to the masses? Can we actually successfully like have it be a robust tool that people use at work?
I see. Okay, so Zephyr then got acquired into Dropbox. That's where I met Waseem. And then Waseem spent 3 or 4 years at Dropbox.
I was at Dropbox for 2 years.
And one day?
2 years, yeah, I think probably like 2 years and then a month or two.
Okay, all right.
And then I took 6 months off, and then we started.
Okay.
Then we started Pilot.
What did you learn about startups from Dropbox?
A lot, actually, which is Dropbox was either tied with or a close second to it, probably tied with MIT on just like sheer talent density. And I think so we had done our first 2 companies in Boston. And I think we had like a little bit of a chip on our shoulder about that, which is like, we're like, oh, you can build a good tech company in Boston. Like, it is possible.
I didn't know that K-Splice was in Boston.
Oh, yeah. Because was right out of MIT. And so we like just, we were down the street in Central Square. We stayed in our hood, And then actually Drew came out like a bunch because he was back for MIT stuff. He was like, you guys have to move to California. This is kind of where it's all happening. And so I think we were like a bit, there was inertia. It's like, well, my friends are here and it's like, it's annoying to move. I think one of the things we saw at Dropbox is like, oh, wow, the talent density here is just like enormous. So I think that was piece one. And then piece two is like, there are disciplines that I kind of knew nothing about, that I had sort of like been a little bit self-taught on by virtue of doing our startups. Because remember, before this, I like had not had a real job. Like, I had done summer internships. Like, I was an intern at AOL, and I was an intern at Amazon, and I was an intern at Google. But like, I had not really worked at a real company before. And so at Dropbox, I think it was like very instructive to see like, oh, this is like world-class design talent, or like, this is what like really good at sales looks like, or this is what the marketing team even does. It's like stuff like that. I think it really broadened our horizons. And then also gave us like a little bit of a preview of like, okay, this is what a company looks like at this size and stage and scale. And these are the things that are working. And maybe these are the things that like are not working as well. And I think that was actually very helpful in thinking about the roadmap for Pilot.
You do Zulip, you get acquired by Dropbox, you stay there for 2 years. But then this time around, instead of kind of jumping into your next thing, you decide to come to SBC very early, right? And this is when the first SBC office, I think at 112 South Park, maybe 27 South Park.
Yeah, that's right.
When Ruchi was kind of like running it. So what prompted the slight change in your ideation kind of like maze? Like, why join SBC in the early days?
Sure. So first of all, so we started Zulip immediately after we left Oracle.
Yep.
And here, after I left Dropbox, I took some time off. I took about 6 months off and just like spent time with my friends and family, and I went and spent some time with my parents and like worked out a lot and just like sort of recharged with the understanding that I was going to come back in 6 months and then actually like, start to tackle this in earnest with Jeff and Jessica. And at the time, SBC was really, it like was not as structured as it is today. It was really kind of like friends of Ruchi hang out in this room. Mm-hmm. Which actually, like, it was still quite unstructured.
Yeah.
And so I think it led to a little bit of like, okay, we know we want to do something. This is sort of a way to like provide a little bit of a frame around that. And I remember actually that time being very unpleasant, not because of SBC, but because actually like the thinking about what you're going to do, it's so unstructured. You can't really do it for 8 hours a day. You can't just like sit there and think. Like, it's not really how it works. And, your internal critic is very strong. There are a million reasons why you come up with the idea, and there are a million reasons why it's not going to work. And you sort of like are forced to contend with those in the process of kind of thinking this through. And I found that very, very unsatisfying. The things I liked more was like, okay, we have a thesis. Now let's go test it. And we'd go and we'd try to find some potential customers. We'd talk to them and say, what are you doing about thing XYZ? And is this a problem you'd have? Like, that I enjoyed because it was like, okay, you know what you need to do. There's kind of like, you can apply energy towards it and advance, the thing you're exploring. Whereas just like sitting around like brainstorming about like, well, maybe we should like build a credit card, or maybe we should start a city, or, maybe we should, it's like, it's a lot more unstructured.
So I guess, is that more an observation about your lived experience, or is that more almost your methodology for how you think about navigating the idea maze, which is that you must have some kind of like, your vector must be moving in some direction?
I think you're happiest if you have a series of hypotheses that you're quickly testing and deciding to further explore or to cut off.
Okay.
But I also, I don't know, like what Tim Abbott, who was also at SBC and was at Dropbox and who was like both K-Splice and Zulip with us. he's like a math genius in addition to being very talented at many other things. And like, I would sometimes just like find him sitting like in the computer club at MIT. He would just be like sitting there. I'd be like, what are you doing? And he's like, I'm like thinking about math. He was just like working on a proof or something, but just like there in his head, if like the gears were just turning. It's like, that's not how I sort of ever have been. Because I prefer the much more active, like, okay, I want to go and like test it in the world and kind of see, you know, how it holds up, how my assumptions change in the presence of new data.
Yeah, one of the things that I find hard / interesting about listening to people I admire is that they all often offer contradictory advice, right? Like particularly around startups, like, you know, everybody seems to have some set of like things that, you know, they believe have led to essentially as a place that you admire. And so I think a lot of the actual journey in starting a company is one of self-discovery, right? Which is then being able to map like, who am I and what works best for me, right? And then being able to find the people that you also admire, and like this person actually seems to be cut from similar cloth, because otherwise it's very easy to get inundated, because then if you really do them, like if you kind of go out and canvas, there's a lot of contradictory advice about like early stage ideation, early stage philosophies. So I'm often like more kind of seeing like what resonates with me, what actually maps to my world belief. So it sounds like you're a man of action.
I like that phrasing. I'll take that.
Okay, all right, yeah.
But I agree with you. I mean, there's some tweet, and I don't know who sent it. It was like, the entrepreneur's advice is like, these are the numbers that helped me win the lottery. It's like, yeah, okay, cool. That's not that actionable for me. Like,
I might steal that one.
that and like this advice is kind of worth what you're paying for it, which is everyone's advice is sort of an imperfect distillation of what they thought worked for them, which may or may not actually be like what really did. And I have been surprised, even just in reviewing my own notes, like how much revisionist history I have about like, oh yeah, the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's actually really hard to go back. And so I famously, as my team is, they don't love me for this, but I hate postmortems, because you're trying to go and relitigate a decision that was done in the past. But my firm belief is that it's actually very hard to go and relitigate it using the exact context window that you had at that point of time. So we can try to relitigate it using new decisions, but trying to go and literally the question is, how would I have done it differently? I'm like, that question doesn't make any sense to me. Right? Because like I'm no longer that person. So we can choose to, how would this decision look different today? But that's a very different like question than like, you know, relitigating something that happened in the past. But with that framing, right? I'm curious, what are some of these things that you have learned about yourself as an entrepreneur and your ability to navigate the -1 that you might be different today, might be different when you started Pilot relative to when you started, like, let's say, K-Splice?
Sort of what evolved in our thinking across these three startups? I think one is we were much, much more attuned to market size, which is in the first company, again, it was just like, oh, this is cool, let's do it. In the second company, it was like, this is a problem we have, and like, this seems like the world needs this, and it seems big enough, like, let's do it. And then with Pilot, I think it was much more like, okay, well, actually, the TAM here is like every small business in the United States, and they all need accounting and they need tax prep and they pay a lot for it. And, you know, you multiply the numbers and like the numbers are very big. The TAM is like functionally infinity. Like we spent a lot more time kind of pressure testing against that, as opposed to literally for K-Splice, it was like, this seems cool. Like, let's go do it. I think that was correct if your objective is to build a venture scale business, and which was our objective. Like
Right.
in some ways,
And you have.
and we have, and in some ways, the like one of the like maybe not as noble motivations for doing Pilot was a little bit like, you look around, you see like these other unicorn or public company CEOs, and you're like, yeah, they're smart, but like they're not smarter than we are. You know, like we can do this. Like, I mean, if they're doing it, like we can probably do it. So there's a certain amount of like, we get chip on our shoulder about that too. And it's like, obviously that's an input too of like, okay, fine. What kind of thing do you want to build? Because the other path, and this is now like more in vogue. And I think, you know, in 2017, when we started Pilot, it was not, it was like, well, you build a thing that's super small and you like don't take a ton of capital and you have huge ownership, and actually like that probably maximizes dollars in your pocket, but it's like a very different shape thing.
It's interesting. Yeah. So by the third company, you were thinking a lot about markets from like day one
Yes.
and less about, is this fundamentally something cool? Is this something that is flashy? It's like, hey, I just don't want to take market risk.
Yeah, I think we believed that basically the technical risks were extremely surmountable by our team because it was just like a very, very strong technical team in almost any domain. It was like, fine, so what are the things that we really need to de-risk? Like it's, well, what is the market opportunity and like what is the market risk?
What do you think is the biggest market opportunity today?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I think that like our thesis when we started Pilot in 2017 was this like tech-enabled services thesis. And at the time, I think it was like fairly contrarian. Now I think it's like a pretty consensus view, but like very clearly there's a bunch of stuff that today is services that will become done by tech companies and, with all the margin expansion that will come from that and, all the TAM expansion that will come from that.
Maybe to ask it another way, it's interesting, like the Pilot's timing is interesting, which is that you're totally correct that back when you first started, probably the biggest question that you got was, is this a services company or is this a tech? I mean, we spent a long time talking about this, right?
Definitely.
Today, it's obvious, right? It's like, yeah, of course, AI is going to make these essentially like, knowledge workers, you'll have knowledge workers who are operating at 1x. Maybe, 5 years ago, the best ones were 3 to 4x, but now you can have like people operating at 20, 30x, right? With the right set of tooling, right set of like essentially like LLMs in the loop. How does one capitalize on that almost like market realization, given that Pilot has also been around for 9 years, right? So how do you in some ways not be too early?
And I think we were a little too early.
Okay.
Which is, I mean, obviously we were the right amount of early. We were not too early. Yes. We like are in prime position to take advantage of all the new stuff that's coming out, like all the capabilities that are available via LLMs. And our thesis was the computer is eventually going to do 99% of it.
Right.
And I think, in 2017, had you asked me, I would have said, well, yeah, deep learning, like neural nets, like, because that's what everyone talked about back then. But it's like, there was a very clear path from the computer does none of the work, which was the status quo at the time. Even if you got the computer to do 70% or 80% of the work, that's still like tremendously impactful.
Yep.
And I think the thing that LLMs have unlocked is like, well, fine, now it's probably not 80%, it's probably 95, maybe it's 99. It's like, okay, but that's like a difference of degree rather than a difference of sort of overall capability in this specific domain. And I think for us, it's like, okay, well, when this stuff becomes available, you sort of have to lean into it. And then you also need to be kind of thoughtful about like, well, what is the moat or like, what is your defensible kind of advantage? Like every single Y Combinator batch for the past 8+ years has had like an AI accounting company in it.
At least one.
It's just like literally every batch, just like someone's like, we should do AI accounting. Well, no one's doing AI accounting. Or I don't know, I guess we think we can do it better than Pilot. And there's a certain amount of just, you kind of just like wait it out.
Yeah.
Like, actually, there are real advantages to brand and size and scale and like install base. And there's a bunch of like hard learned lessons that sort of we've had to contend with that like at first blush you don't see. So there is a little bit about just like you kind of just have to outlast like the other people in the space.
So maybe sticking on that theme around perseverance, surviving, having grit, 9 years is a long time. Right. Like, I think especially in startups, because you go through a lot of ups and downs, right?
Yes.
Like the classic, it's every startup is dog years. But how have you maintained, I think, your energy and kind of like your, frankly, your optimism as well, right? Because I'm sure it kind of goes through ups and downs. So if you had to mentor kind of like a fellow founder on how to kind of deal with, the emotions of it, what would you say?
There are times in the company's life where it's like you feel like your success is definitely assured. Like of course, you're going to be a...
It's like 10 a.m. every morning.
Yeah, totally, yeah, exactly. And then there are times when you're like, oh God, this is like not working.
2 p.m. every day.
Yeah. And everyone feels like that all the time. And so I think one is exactly just like actually acknowledging that. Like that's the experience of every company, even the companies that outwardly appear super successful. Yeah. And then thing two is this sounds trite, but I think it is true, which is like it really is the journey, not the destination, which is like you have to understand kind of why you're playing the game and sort of like what you hope to get out of it. Because at every point it feels like, well, if you just hit this milestone, like you will have succeeded. Like, oh, if we can just raise that Series A, like it'll really feel like it's working. And then you do that. It's like, well, if we can just raise that Series B, like it'll really feel like it's working. And then you do that. It's like, well, if only we could raise that Series C. Like that, the game never ends, actually.
The game never ends.
Even at IPO, it's like that's people, if you talk to CEOs that have IPO their companies, with the founders that IPO their companies, they'll tell you like the IPO is the beginning. It's not the end.
It's like literally the first thing, the first thing after probably the first, evening of champagne is that, fuck, we better have 2 good quarters, So
Right.
like, because like lockups and we need to make sure that we hit our numbers.
Right.
In fact, the game actually becomes a lot more intense.
Short-term,
Yeah, short-term, intense. Exactly.
Yes. So I think like insight one as well, you cannot beat the game. And so if you're playing it like I just need to get to the final boss and beat the final boss and then I'll have finished the game, you're going to be pretty unhappy because like the game in fact never ends.
Right.
And so instead, I think you have to say, well, how do I make the day-to-day one that is on balance, enjoyable and fulfilling for me? Like, am I learning? Am I being stretched in ways I like? Am I being challenged? Am I working with people I like? And this, again, it kind of goes back to the thing we talked about at the very beginning, which is like, if the day-to-day elements are ones you find kind of enriching and rewarding, you will have the endurance to slog through.
Yeah.
If the day-to-day stuff starts to suck and it remains bad for an extended period of time, you will give up. It's just like it will grind you down eventually.
Yeah. It's before you get on to, I think you had multiple points there. I'll add a couple of things. One of the things that Mark said to us at Facebook that has always stuck with me, he's like, there will be a lot of stuff about us externally, right? There'll be lots of times when people are saying we are awesome. There'll be lots of times where people say we suck. It is rarely we are never as good as the world thinks we are. We are never as bad as the world thinks we are. It's all just kind of like more muted. And like the external world is kind of used to amping up either signal up or down. So it really is just about kind of like finding that constancy. And the second thing I often think about, and this is a little... I think I think of SPC as a startup. As a startup founder, you're not allowed to use this language, but you almost have to disassociate yourself a little bit from the startup, right? So the way I tend to think about it is that it's very hard when like you think you are the startup, because that means the game in some ways, if the game ends, that means the startup dies or you die. I mean, but that sucks. But I tend to think of it as, listen, I hope I'm at SPC, for a very long time, but this institution will continue after me. And my goal is that as long as I'm here, I leave it better than where I found it, right? And having that distance actually, I think, allows you to manage your own emotions as being a little bit separate from the company. And I'm still learning how to do this, but I think it's something that I've had to develop over the years, where I am not the startup. Right. And I think it's tricky because in some ways in the early days, you are the startup.
Right.
Like there is nothing. The IP is you, right? The product is like you. You need to both believe that, but have some distance.
I strongly agree with that. You have to take everything like very personally and deeply care.
Right.
And you can't let it be the sole defining thing of your existence, in the sense that like this is an adjacent point, which is in general, I think when folks get to the point where they've raised the Series B or the Series C and you have an opportunity to take a little bit of money off the table, like a little bit of money, you definitely should.
Yeah.
Because it allows you to swing for the fences. It allows you to take bigger bets, because there is something very important about being able to say, well, if this thing totally fails, and obviously I hope it won't fail, and I don't think it will fail, I, Waseem Daher as a person, like I'm not going to be homeless, like it'll be fine. My family like will still be okay. And it's just sort of like, again, it's like separating you and the startup. You sort of, to let the startup reach its full potential, you need to be at peace with a world in which it doesn't succeed. Because if you're operating from a place of downside minimization, you're not going to actually like be successful. You have to be willing to place bets that may or may not work.
Yeah, I think this is actually for me one of the fundamental, in some ways, paradoxes of being at a startup, where you both have to deeply, deeply care, and in some ways really believe that you can shape the outcome, but then also be at peace with the fact that the world is very complex, right? The world will do things that are completely out of your control, and that perhaps in the in the totality of things, your ability to control things might actually only be 5%. There's a bunch of shit that might happen externally that you cannot control, but that doesn't mean that you must have, you can give up and kind of like, in some ways let go of like what you can control, right? So I think this is very difficult to kind of like internalize because they are somewhat contradictory. But if you can find that balance, sometimes more than other times, I think it really is helpful.
I agree. I mean, I'm not like a big card player, but it's like kind of like you're dealt a certain hand in your poker game, and like sometimes it's a bad beat.
Right.
But it's like, well, these are the cards I had and I played them as well as I could have, like given what I knew at the time. It's like, I think that's the kind of thing that you're sort of aiming for.
Yeah, absolutely. And that, and I think that the other thing that helps you with startups is just speed, right? Because the quicker you can recover, if you do have a bad beat, the more you can also have some chips on the table in some ways to kind of play the next hand. It can help a lot. So what do you think most founders actually get wrong about company building?
I think this is a consensus view at this point, but I think you basically, as the company grows, you kind of like internalize this advice of like, oh, I need to hire VPs, I need to hire a head of sales, I need to hire a sales rep. And like, then all of those people, like the machine is what interacts with the world and you kind of get the data fed through the machine. And I think that's actually very dangerous. Again, this is not a super hot take, but it's like you want to remain as close to kind of reality as possible. And that frequently requires you to go and do stuff yourself or inspect things yourself.
Yeah, I'm genuinely curious at which point in like our collective, I would say, wisdom on building companies, we came to this idea that there could be people who were not actually kind of on the front lines, like learning about what is happening so that they could manage through abstractions. Because that just more and more, I'm like, that does not make any sense.
Yeah, it basically doesn't work.
It just doesn't work. Yeah.
They say like, oh, you should hire someone who would do the job better than you would, and then you should delegate to them. And like, not to be a dick, there are a lot of jobs where like, no, I would do it better than you would do it, like for arbitrary you. And the challenge is actually a scaling challenge. It's like, no, I don't have time to do every single sales call. It's like, it's not the highest leverage use of my time.
Yeah.
But it's like, I think if that's the case, it's actually pretty dangerous to just like hand the keys to someone and be like, okay, you do all the sales calls and just like, let me know how it goes.
I mean, the other flip side of this is like, oh, you should hire yourself out of a job or something, right? And I'm just like, no, that doesn't make any sense to me because I should be world class at what I'm doing. And by definition, that means there should be almost zero people better than me at what I'm doing. So that doesn't make any sense to me.
I think there are some areas that are like high leverage and high impact for you. Like this sounds like a plug. You probably don't need to be doing your own accounting. Like you should probably do that. But like there is some
I've never done any accounting.
Exactly. There's some stuff where it is actually just not strategic for you to do it. And those are, I think, phenomenal places to delegate. There's some stuff that's so on the critical path of the business's success, though. And I think if you just like are a passenger on that stuff, that's very dangerous. What matters there actually changes over time. It's like, in the early days, it might be building the product or selling the initial, units or whatever. In later days, it might be the marketing campaign, or it's just like, that's a moving target. And so you actually have to be pretty abreast of like what's happening in the org so that you can sort of insert yourself at the kind of point of maximum leverage.
Sometimes what I see at the early stages is when a founder is working on something that is clearly the alpha is in the technology, or like, hey, the hardest part here is getting the technology right. Or sometimes it's actually like getting the storytelling right, because ultimately technology is hard, but perhaps not kind of like, 0.01% hard. But then the founder chooses to kind of say that, oh, this is the most important thing, but I'm going to go hire somebody else to do it. And then in my head, I'm thinking like, that doesn't make any sense, because the founder by definition should be doing the hardest thing in the beginning, right? They should be the world-class expert at doing the hardest thing. And then over time, their job is to find people who help them do the other things, because they should continue to focus on the hardest thing. So I strongly believe that micromanagement is actually not a bad thing. Like staying in the weeds, staying in the details is awesome. And as the founder and CEO, you should actually have a really good understanding of every function in the company, right? It might take you a little bit of time to get ramped up, but like on everything, finance, legal, HR, marketing, sales, like you should, like if somebody left in those roles, you should be able to go and play that role until like you have to hire someone else. What do you think perhaps has changed in this day and age of kind of like AI? Like, do you think something has to change about company creation or company scaling? Scaling is perhaps an easier question, maybe about company creation.
Yeah, I mean, scaling, surely the answer is yes. I think on creation, I think it is true that the barrier to entry is lower than it's ever been.
Mhm.
And I think that's actually really powerful because rather than drawing the picture now, you can like vibe code the prototype and have someone play with it. And look, that's obviously different than the production code, but like your ability to just like go and produce v0.01 of any given thing is like easier than it has ever been. And that is a trend that actually was true pre-AI as well, which is like when we started our very first company in 2008, there was like a real question about like, are we going to put a server in a data center to like host our email? And I was like, no, we should just like use Google Apps. But that was like not the obvious story. There's like Google Apps and Stripe and like all of this stuff like has made like running the infrastructure of your company much, much easier and therefore made company creation sort of much more accessible.
Yep.
And I think the last frontiers of this historically had been like, building the product or doing the design around the product or stuff adjacent to that. And like we're starting to see that chip away too, which is pretty cool.
Maybe to kind of finish up here, how do you stay curious, Waseem? You've always struck me as like someone who is deeply curious about the world, but as with the jobs of like running a company, having young kids, how do you find that you are refilling your cup of curiosity?
I mean, one of the nice things about the startup is that the target is always moving. And like once you've mastered the thing, the game changes and then you like have to master the new thing. So in that sense, it is always like difficulty adjusted to just be annoyingly hard.
Yeah.
Which is not great like on one axis, but from a like you're not bored perspective, like that definitely sort of is a feature there.
Okay. Awesome. Well, Waseem, I'm sure we could go on for a long time, but we're kind of out of time here. So thank you again for coming by, sharing your -1 stories. It's always a pleasure to have you back. And thank you again.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thank you.